Good morning. We're so glad to have you all here today. We're also glad to have our participants sharing with us online as well today. I promised Claire I would give her a very brief introduction. Our presenter today is ClaireBowen. She's a high school senior, and she'll tell you much more about herself and her generation in a matter of seconds here. But what I'd like to invite you to do is to join me. What I'd like to invite you to do is to join me in prayer over Claire. Claire has worked long and hard in preparing this presentation, and we'd like to invite the Holy Spirit to speak through Claire to us. And so, just like with confirmation, Claire, which wasn't that long ago, I invite everybody to take their hands and place a hand over Claire as we pray. Lord God, send forth your Spirit and let Claire speak words of wisdom, counsel, knowledge, courage, patience, fortitude, all the good stuff that we're promised through the Holy Spirit. We ask you, Lord, to give Claire your words, your sensibilities, and helping her to challenge us to be your church. And we ask all this through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, here and online, ClaireBowen.
Thank you, Scott. Hi, I'm ClaireBowen. A lot of familiar faces in the crowd, so hello to anybody that I don't know. Hello, it's wonderful to meet you, and I hope you guys learned some stuff and that I can talk to you guys more after. So, I know everybody just got comfortable, but I'm gonna make you guys move. So we're gonna start by counting off in threes. So we're gonna start in the front here. So 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. And then Father Bowen, you can be a 3. So my 1s, can I have you guys move over by Scott? My 2s, can you move into these first 4 rows? And then my 3s, can you move behind that? So in the next 4 rows, please. It's going to be for the rest of the time. All right, so now that we're in our groups, look around. These are going to be the faces that you're going to talk to and hear from for the next about 2 hours. So, who am I? As Scott already said, I am a high school senior. I am currently 17, so that puts me as a member of Gen Z, which we'll learn more about in a minute. I am a pastoral council member here at St. John's as one of our youth members. And I am an ASP volunteer, so we help out those in need around here and in the Appalachia area. So what we're going to do now is, in your group, we're going to introduce yourselves. So I want you to say your name, your reason for attending, what generation you belong to, and what your parish, because I know some of you aren't from St. John's, what it does well when it talks to young people. And for my folks that are virtual, I want you guys to think about why you decided to stay here and watch this today, and what generation you fall into, and what's one skill that you bring to your parish that is helpful to young people. And then here are the generational breakdowns, so you can look at them and see them and figure out which one you fit into. Okay, we're gonna start moving on, so if we can wrap up those quick conversations. Okay, so can I have everybody's attention real quick? So I'm gonna say a few things, and if I call the generation you fall into, I want you to raise your hand. The silent generation. The silent generation, raise your hand when your generation is called. Okay. Baby boomers. That's a lot of baby boomers. Gen X. Millennials. All right, 2. And Gen Z. Just me. So we're going to look at some staggering statistics. So I have 3 that we're going to start off with to sort of set the tone. Only 22% of millennial Catholics attend Mass weekly. Gen X. Gen Z is highly distracted with an attention span of only 8 minutes. We're going to use that 8 minutes a little later on. You're going to see both how long 8 minutes is, because you can brush your teeth 4 times during that. But you're also going to see how short 8 minutes is. And only 43% of millennials pray daily compared to the 78% of baby boomers. So here's a quote from Pope Francis. If you, the youth, are not present, then a part of the access to God is missing. So I think this quote is very important because as a church, we don't always do the best job of inviting young people. But Pope Francis recognizes that and is able to put it into words and is saying, we need the youth. They are important. They are just as important as everybody else. And an important part of this picture is that it's from NCYC, which some of you may know, some of you may not. It's the National Catholic Youth Conference, and it's youth from all across the U.S. come together, pray, learn, sing, all kinds of good stuff. So it's a big group of young people, and it shows how powerful young people can be, especially if they're all together, and that we aren't as much of a dying church as some people think. 10,000 people, 10,000 young people. And Mass is held at an NFL stadium, so it tells you a little bit. So getting social. There are 2 things here. There's both online being social as well as in person. So before we can talk about being social online, we have to recognize that there is so much social media. And it comes in all different forms. There's work and networking, like LinkedIn. There's some dance stuff, like TikTok. There's places where you can share your life with, like Facebook and Instagram. And then there are areas where you can save ideas that you like and maybe want to do in the future, such as Pinterest. So social media is a huge part in the lives of millennials and of Gen Z. They are always on their phone, always looking at Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. Any of the above is probably what's open on their phone. So millennials spend about 4 hours a day on social media. It's about 1/6 of their day, 1/4 of their time awake. Gen Z spends more than that. They spend about 4.5 hours a day. It's about 1/5 of their day. And Gen Z also spends, in more depth, 10 or more hours every day online. And they're not just using one device at a time. On average, we're using 2 or more devices. So if all I'm looking at all day long is a computer, that's where I'm going to get a majority of my information. And because I'm on that computer all of the time, my digital footprint, which many of you may not know what that means, but it means like how much of my information is out in the world, is huge. And it's exposed to a lot of content. So as a church, we need to be that content. We need to be the content that young people are seeing and that they engage with, because they're more likely to pay attention to it. Now, on the in-person side, we need to be open to discussion. We need to reach out to others to start having difficult conversations. And I don't think any of us here today or watching are afraid of those difficult conversations because, well, you're here and you are watching. So part of having those conversations is asking what works and what doesn't work. For instance, bulletins. How many people here pick up the bulletin every week? I've never picked up a newspaper, never opened a newspaper. I mean, like, I know what it is. I get it out of the driveway for my mom, but I've never read it other than maybe the comic section once. So having a bulletin doesn't impact me at all because it's just another newspaper and I've never needed to look at a newspaper. So to me, if you ask me, is a bulletin working? No, because I don't see any of the information in it. But when we start putting a e-bulletin in emails, I look at my email every day, more than once a day, probably once or twice every hour. So I see that, I open it, I read it, there we go, I have my information. And I didn't have to pick anything up. Traditions. I know that in the past, the church has had some big changes in the senses of music, and that has caused a big divide. But young people aren't always the most traditional, right? We listen to all kinds of music because that music is at our fingertips. So, I listen to at least 30 different genres of music. So for me, traditional music doesn't really do anything because it's like, oh, that's pretty, but I don't have any relation to it. And there are so many other examples that this is just the tip of the iceberg. So if we ask young people, they're willing to tell you because they want their voices heard, and we want you to know what works, what doesn't work, and how we should fix it. And we're gonna watch a video here for a few minutes.
Prior, that's when they were born. They were the World War II generation. They're the generation, the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw would call them. And some of you might not even know who Tom Brokaw is when I say that name, because if you're of a certain age, he's not the newscaster that you grew up with. You also probably don't know your current newscaster because for some generations, the evening news is not a part of their cultural experience. So that's the silent generation. Then we go to baby boomers, right? 1946 to 1964. They came of age in that post-World War II optimism. They also remember Vietnam, JFK. They are there and alive and actively following Vatican II, which says a lot sometimes about what then happens to the next generation. The big thing about baby boomers that I'm always really struck by is that a lot of trends, that a lot of data shows that baby boomers who should be retiring are still working. And the question isn't whether or not they saved enough as they were in the workforce as 30 and 40 and 50-year-olds, but because their millennial children are still very much dependent upon them. I'm a perfect example of this. I'm a millennial born in 1989, and I'm still on a cell phone plan. And I admit that, not because I'm like saving money on work, but because that's not the case. It's just cheaper to stay on my current cell phone plan, and I'm a thrifty millennial. And so I can pay for Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, and Spotify, and they would never have those subscriptions unless I gave them the logins, and they can just pay for the Sprint bill. So baby boomers still very much have their kids involved and engaged in their regular financial experiences in life, and they also consume old media. And when I say old media, I'm talking cable, I'm talking the nightly news, the morning Today Show. We then shift to Gen X, and I often like to call Gen X the forgotten generation because in between baby boomers, and of course OK boomers part of our conversation now, and millennials that everybody wants to blame everything on, you have Gen X, 65 to 80, the Ronald Reagan kids. And when I say Ronald Reagan, I mean like they remember the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Not that they were born during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. They understand the phrase trickle-down economics. They remember the falling of the Berlin Wall. They're called the latchkey generation. And part of it is because their parents weren't helicopter parents, but they were very much attached to still the traditions of family, which millennials very much kind of move away from. And the trends kind of show that millennials ask bigger questions than Gen Xers ever really did. Gen Xers came of age during MTV. Most Gen Xers can tell you where they were the day that first video played for 24 straight hours. They are people of kind of two worlds where they can remember some of the things that happened in the 60s, the hippie free love movement, but they are the 80s kids. Stranger Things was made for Gen Xers to be able to kind of steep themselves in the nostalgia of when they came of age during that 80s decade. Now, a lot of millennials will often joke, oh, I love Stranger Things, I love the nostalgia, but see, the 80s was always nostalgic for us. For a Gen Xer, it is what they enjoyed naturally. One interesting thing about Gen X that I really love is that they are a generation that live on Facebook, just like baby boomers. If you really think about your Facebook scroll, who's sharing articles, who's posting like 18 pictures at a time, usually unfiltered and blurry, who is commenting and arguing in com boxes? That's your Gen Xers and your baby boomers. Millennials and Gen Zers are often making fun of the Facebook landscape. The other really interesting thing about Gen X is that they still are attached to some of that old media, reading newspapers, magazines, watching cable TV, but they are beginning to drift into that streaming element more. You'll often hear Gen Xers make a joke, oh, I'm not technology savvy. You'll never hear a millennial say that. None of us will ever admit that we don't know technology. Baby boomers and Gen X, baby boomers, it's a badge of honor. I don't know technology, my kids do all that for me. A Gen Xer, it kind of like joke about like, oh, well, some of that technology, I don't really understand what's going on, but I still kind of use it. Now, I'm making very big generalizations about some of these different generations. The big thing to remember is the age gaps. Millennials are born starting in 1980, starting in 81. Some sociologists put it all the way up to 83, but I like to knock it back to 1980. They're the children of baby boomers, and they remember three big things. 9/11, most millennials can tell you not only where they were, but what they were doing, and in the conversations that happened in the days following. I was born in 1989. I was in the 7th grade when 9/11 happened. I remember sitting in my classroom. I remember going to daily mass that evening. I remember going to youth group the following Sunday, and it was all anybody talked about, rightly so, for weeks. And then my family took a trip to Washington, D.C. the summer after 9/11. We'd had it scheduled for a year. And distinctly remembering a pre-9/11 traveling on airplanes and a post-9/11 traveling on airplanes. Millennials remember that. Millennials recognize that there was kind of a turn of the tide and a difference in the world when that event occurred. The other big thing that millennials especially remember, and again, millennials born in the early 80s, 80 to 83, up to 95, 96. And it's a smaller gap of like a 15-year generation because they also distinctly remember the sex abuse crisis of 2002. If you were a 5-year-old in the sex abuse crisis of 2002, you don't fully understand what was going on. If you were a 15-year-old and you hear these things, you see these things, mom and dad are talking about these things, it's in the news, your diocese is directly affected by these things, that seeps into your brain. That seeps into your mind and your experience and understanding of church. So now, all of a sudden, for a millennial who remembers 9/11 and who remembers the sex abuse crisis, the two safest places in the world, your country and your church, all of a sudden are no longer a safe place. All of a sudden are now a place where things have happened that have deeply, deeply affected you. Now, that's the first thing I share about millennials because it does greatly influence, I think, the way millennials exist within the world. And we're often mocked for needing a safe place. We're often mocked for that mindfulness kind of attitude that has become part of the conversation of millennials. But if you remember those two things, well, it makes a lot of sense that that's a time of life. That's what was happening in the world when we grew up. So one of the most interesting things about millennials is the technology expansion in their lifetime. So in 1980, Dad still had a bag phone in the back trunk of his car. By the mid-90s, they've got cell phones, and if you remember, I distinctly remember my uncle coming over for Christmas one year and showing us the smallest flip phone available. And like the purpose of it was to be super tiny, but to still be able to make phone calls. And then just a few years after that, he shows up with the first iPhone. And now it's this like giant block in his pocket, but it gives him access to the internet. We went from a computer maybe to a desktop in the corner of the living room to the home phone number is no longer relevant because I have my own personal cell phone, to my child, a child of 2 millennials, will never have a home phone number because I'm not going to get suckered into buying one. And the fact that that technology has expanded so quickly, the fact that we grew up with dial-up internet was the only way to get online, and most of us can still hear the sound of the AOL jingle slash the ka-churr coming in, all the way to I can access anything in my pocket instantly. I have 5 different devices in my bag anytime I travel that can give me access to the World Wide Web. I carry a block that allows me to make sure I always have a charge. We came of age in the largest technology expansion in human history. Oftentimes in history class, you're hearing about the Industrial Revolution and how that really changed the way that the world just existed and operated. Well, think about coming of age when you were born, you were still using a VCR. And now, as a 30-year-old, you don't even own a DVD player, right? Like, the way that I watch television, my child will never know commercials. And in fact, I will mostly choose to stream something a day later so that I don't have to watch the commercials, which then has led the whole advertisement industry to rethink the way that they approach a millennial with purchasing an item. So millennials really came of age during this technology and internet boom. That should scare us a little bit as a church, because the technology and internet boom within Catholicism has been quite small. And oftentimes the way that we use new media is often uninspiring, especially within certain parish communities where we're still passing out paper bulletins to groups of young adults that have never read a newspaper or have only ever accessed the newspaper via Twitter. Now, I know some of this sounds kind of boring, and it sounds like, again, we're kind of sludging through these different things about these generations, but again, thinking about what affected them, thinking about what they've grown up in, thinking about the devices that they've used, it matters in the way that we translate information to them. So Gen Z is born from 97 up to about 2013, 2014. The next generation after that doesn't have a name yet. A lot of people are calling them Gen Alpha because we're just starting the alphabet over. So my child is a Gen Alpha. She's 2. But Gen Z, also iGen in some conversations, and we'll see if that nickname sticks. I think they're giving them that nickname because the iPhone is really one of the only devices they've ever known. They are a generation that has never not known the internet. They're a generation that is completely and totally native in the digital landscape. A millennial learned the internet. We learned how to type. A millennial remembers when computers were brought into the computer lab at school. A Gen Z goes to school with their own personal laptop. A Gen Z not only has their own personal laptop for school that was maybe given to them by the school, but has an iPad at home, an iPhone in their pocket, AirBuds. AirBud is a movie that millennials remember that Gen Zs would not. AirPods. See, as a millennial, I can't even get the word of our headphones correct. A Gen Zer has never not had headphones readily available to listen to their own personal device whenever they want to. One of my favorite things to do in airports is watch people waiting in line. And that's a really weird thing, but I'm a weird person. If you're standing in like the coffee shop line at the Starbucks in the Denver airport, a baby boomer that's traveling alone will be watching the line, like watching to see as people are moving forward. A Gen Xer usually is not traveling alone, probably like wrangling kids or grandkids, or like they'll check their phone from time to time. Millennials and Gen Zs do not look up from their device until it is their turn. In fact, they probably ordered it from their device and are just waiting for someone to call their name in the corner. I'll never forget, we stopped at a Chick-fil-A on a road trip one time. We walked in, the line was out the door, and I looked over at my husband and I was like, I think I'm just gonna use the app. And so we sat down at a booth and I used the app, and 20 minutes later our food was delivered to our table. And this very sweet older couple was sitting behind us. And they leaned forward and they're like, how did you do that? So I showed them the app and we downloaded it and I helped them make a profile, and I felt like it was my good deed of the day to help an older couple learn how to use the Chick-fil-A app and earn points and get their food ahead of time. And it didn't really occur to me until I got back into the car how weird it must be for a baby boomer who only ever went to a sit-down restaurant as a child can now order food that is brought to your table instantly. These distinctions matter. And Gen Z has never not known this uber-connected digital world.
All right, so who learned something new in that video? A lot of people, right? I learned new stuff too. So here is another quote. This is from a different pope, and it talks about our understanding is limited. And it's all about the generations and how those generations change. So I read this, and I thought of two very different types of generations. The first is the generations that we went through earlier. Gen X, baby boomers, millennials, Gen Z. And we all have different things that we've grown up with and remember, and that has impacted the way we learn and the way we take information in. So the church needs to adapt to each generation as a new generation comes in so that those generations feel welcomed and are also able to learn. But then I was thinking, well, there's been a lot of popes. And I know some of them, have had the papacy for a long time and others not so much. So then I was thinking, maybe the generation that we're talking about isn't the generation we normally think of. Maybe it's the generation of each pope. Because every pope has different thoughts and different things that they focus on while they're holding the papacy. So then I did some research. I found out I'm 17. I've lived through 3 popes. I'm not at the beginning or the end of my generation. And I'm already on my 3rd pope. So, I think that's a little bit crazy. And then I did some more research. The shortest papacy was 33 days. If every papacy was 33 days, as of today, I would be on my 190th pope. The longest was 32 years. If every pope sat there for 32 years, I'm not even done with one. And then the average is 7.25 years. 7.25 years is a lot shorter than what we classify people into generations. So if that generation of a pope is less than 8 years, how quickly is the church turning over? How quickly should we be adapting and changing? Pretty quickly, I think. If 8 years, if every 8 years we can change, we're going to be even better than if we were only adapting with every new generation. And this picture is also from NCYC, but this is the Baltimore group that went last year. So now, the nuns versus the nuns. So 22.7% of the United States identifies as Catholic. 17% of the United States identifies as nothing in particular. There are as many millennials that never go to church as there are those that go to church regularly. So we're going to start with the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. They don't think of the church at all. It was never part of their life growing up, so they don't understand why it should be now. They were also never involved in the church, whether that be the Catholic Church or any other church. So it doesn't hold any value in their life. They don't see a need to go and join a church and become part of it, and they don't understand what it's all about. They also worship status. And what do I mean by that? Well, when we talk about millennials and Gen Z, they are always on social media, and therefore they always want the most amount of likes. So, I got 100 likes. Oh, great. I got 300 likes. Oh my gosh, I'm amazing. And then we've grown up in an age where everybody sees influencers or people that do things and then people follow them. And I think if you asked a majority of young people, they would say, oh yeah, at some point I wanted to be an influencer, which is a status. It's marked by sometimes a blue check mark that just says, you are famous, you are awesome. And they also worship status, but they aren't driven by money. So they're more materialistic. Now, they aren't atheist. They just don't feel as though they're accepted in the church. They may still be Christian and just don't go to Mass or don't attend a physical church, but they read their Bible and they pray, but they aren't anything in particular. Now, the nuns, N-U-N-S. I'm not talking about the ladies that walk around in a habit. I'm talking about everybody here. You're a nun. You have a strong faith because you probably grew up in the church or decided on your own free will that the church is where you wanted to be. And therefore, you love being here. And you long to worship. You long to pray, whether that's on your own, with people, through whatever means it takes. Now, at one point, you were a lost sheep or a prodigal son, just as the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are currently the prodigal son and lost sheep. So we're going to do a little activity. Don't worry, you don't really have to move. First, I want everybody to close their eyes and put anything in your hands down. I want you to think, have you ever been lost? Were you found? What about welcomed home? Now, I would like everybody to stand up. Keep your eyes closed. Once you stand up, you can open them to stand up, though. All right, and then close your eyes again. I want you to raise your right hand if you have been lost. And then I want you to raise your left hand if you are found. If you're comfortable, you can stay standing. If you would like to take a seat, feel free. If you take a seat, put your hands in your lap if you had any raised. Now I want everybody to open their eyes and look around the room. Look at the number of hands in the air. Look how many people have both hands in the air. They were lost just as you were, just as I was, and then they were found just as you were and just as I was. So let's go find those that are lost because they deserve it just as we did. And you guys can all take a seat. So, millennials. 56% of baby boomers attend Mass weekly. 28% of millennials attend Mass weekly. It's a pretty big difference. So I want everybody to think, how important is God in your life? Well, I'm going to assume, since you're here or watching, it's probably pretty important. Now, if God is important to you, you trust him, right? So you're willing to go to him when you have problems and ask for help and hear what he has, and you trust that he can actually do something about it, yes? But millennials think God is many millennials think God is of equal importance to them. So if they can't help themselves, why would they turn to God? What would he ever be able to do to help? Millennials also hop pews and parishes because they don't feel like a part of a community. Now, millennials will almost always say that community is a huge part of what they long for in life. So when a millennial walks in and walks through those back doors and sees an open seat, and they sit down, and they go to Mass, and they enjoy Mass, and then they come back next week, and somebody's sitting there. They don't sit around there. They see an open spot over here, and they come sit over here. It's not very much community going on if you're just walking in, sitting down, and walking out. You're not talking to anybody. And then the next week, maybe they don't want to come to 10 o'clock Mass because they decided they wanted to sleep in till noon. So they want to go to a evening Mass, but they're going to dinner with their friends. So they have to go to an earlier evening Mass. well, they don't have any specific reason to come here. They don't necessarily feel like they're part of that community. So they go to a different parish. And okay, they enjoy Mass there. Maybe they go back there the next week. Maybe they don't. Maybe they go to a completely different parish. This can be stopped, but it involves everybody in the parish, not just the leadership, but everybody to be willing and open to reaching out to young people, or even just people they've never seen before. This community allows them to feel involved and makes them more willing to stick around. Now, when I say untraditionally traditional, that's a little bit of an oxymoron. So the number of millennials that give up meat on Fridays during Lent is a lot higher than the number that attend Mass. Why is that? Well, there's not exactly an answer, but I think that it's probably because it's a memory. They grew up with their parents, and their parents were like, oh, Fridays during Lent, no meat. You can eat, mac and cheese for dinner. And because of that, that's what they associate with Lent. They feel like, oh, I'm doing something good, this is right. So we need to use little things like not eating meat on Fridays in Lent to bring people into the church. They've taken the first step. They want you to come out and get them, so we just got to go find them, bring them in, because you always need a first step before you can start walking. Now, they also value personal relationships, and I know everybody values personal relationships. We like having friends and family that we trust, but millennials value them so much that they end a lot of sentences with, I don't know. And that's common with millennials, but also I think the older part of Gen Z. We say, I don't know, after pretty much everything in order to distance ourselves from what we said. For instance, if you ask me, oh, what's your favorite pizza place in Columbia? Oh, well, I like Philly's Best over in Thunder Hill, but I don't know. Because maybe you have a different favorite pizza place, and I don't want to make you feel bad about that, so I say, I don't know. And on something as little as a pizza place, who really cares? Just say what you want. Nobody's going to take offense to it. It's not like, oh my gosh, you go there? How dare you? I can't be friends with you anymore. But when it gets into bigger things like political opinions, how do you feel about this? Well, I feel this way, but I don't know. Because if you feel that way, or feel the other way, I don't want to make you feel bad, because I know what it feels like to feel bad. And this mindset of I don't know has caused a lot of self-doubt to spread through millennials, because I don't know anything. They don't feel good enough about anything they believe or want to do, so why would they want to try? They don't think they are important enough, so why would they be important to God? So when it comes to this, we need to convert and re-engage millennials, but not by force. We can't just say, oh, you got to come to church. It's, oh, well, I go to church because I like this, and I think you would like it too, and then we can go and talk about it afterwards. Make a personal relationship. Now, situational morality. Also a weird one. A lot of people believe right is right and wrong is wrong. And if that's what you believe, you're probably over the age of 40. A lot of millennials and Gen Z think that, yes, there is right and there is wrong, but it's a spectrum. It all is based off of, how it impacts people and what's going on in the world. For instance, what if a man walks into a supermarket and steals food? Is that wrong? Yes, right? Well, what if I told you he's unemployed, his wife is unemployed, his mother, who has Alzheimer's, lives with him, and they have 5 kids. The youngest kid is sick, and they can't afford medicine, and nobody can go get a job because somebody has to watch the kids and grandma. They're on food stamps, but that doesn't cover diapers, doesn't cover vegetables. What's he supposed to do now? Does stealing that food so his family can eat really seem so wrong? You may still think yes, and you're allowed to think that, but if you ask millennials and Gen Z, the vast majority are gonna empathize with him and say, no, that we need to help him. It may have been wrong, but there's some way we can do it, and he was just in doing it. And this also comes from those personal relationships. It comes from wanting others to feel happy and good about themselves. So when we lead young people, we can't lead with a rule book. It's not, oh, you have to do this because this is the way it's always been. It's leading with charity, because that's going to engage people and invite them more than just do it. Now, some Gen Z. So we're going to start with some similarities. The first thing is that we all grew up with science and technology at our fingertips. So who here has a cell phone on them? Who here has more than one device on them? All right, how many do you have? Okay, how many do you have? Okay. All right, I have my computer, I have my watch, I have my phone, I have my pencil, which is a computer, I have my iPad, and I have my AirPods. And I don't leave the house without any of it. I leave the house without the computer, but pretty much everything else is with me almost all the time. And I use pretty much all of it all of the time. Now, Gen Z are also dreamers, and we want a safe place to dream. Gen Z is bold. And when I say that, I mean that we don't need permission. And we don't exactly want it. Yeah, most of us are teenagers or younger, and we should ask our parents stuff, and we do. But sometimes when you hear no, it's, well, why not? There's not necessarily a reason why not, and because we've grown up with everything at our fingertips, we don't understand the reasoning. So, as an example, my mom, a few years ago, was always like, oh, well, I don't want you going on runs. It's dangerous. It's dangerous? Well, I live in Columbia, where there are a ton of paths, and everyone runs on the paths. I have a phone. I can call you if I'm in trouble. I can call 911. How is that so dangerous? I know half of the people I'm going to see. So, honestly, I did listen. I wouldn't go on those runs, but it was still, why would I need permission? It's not that big of a deal. And I would say a majority of Gen Z, even if they don't get permission, still probably do what they asked if they could do. Gen Z brings new life to the church. And by them being there, creates a more vibrant church. And Gen Z wants to learn, be engaged some more, be re-engaged more, and so on and so forth. So now we're going to start on the differences. We're going to start with the non-Christian or disaffiliated Gen Z. So because they've grown up with science, they want hard answers. They want an explanation for the reasoning. So as an example, in 7th grade, one of the boys in my table in science, who I don't know anything about his religious background, but he asked me if I was religious. And I said yes. Obviously, I am, and it's a big part of my life. So I was happy to engage in this conversation. And he asks, well then how come you believe in science? And for a second, I was like, what? Oh, that doesn't make sense. God is science. He allows it all to happen. And then I was like, I just didn't know what to say. I'm thinking. He was like, well, you believe the world was created in 7 days, but you also believe in evolution. It doesn't really work. And still, I was pretty stunned, and I was like, what? That doesn't make sense, You're right. But I thought about it, and I had an answer for him. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that those 7 days were 24 human hours. Who knows? They were God days. Who knows how long a God day is? I'm not living on a God day as far as I know. And I think that those God days could be millions and millions of years, and therefore 7 days, that's right. And within each of those days, so much happened that it can be explained by what scientists and the rest of the world call evolution. So yes, I have a hard answer. My hard answer is evolution, but it's backed up by God. So non-Christians also don't feel important at a church. They feel like the people there don't care about them. Moving on to the unengaged Christian. To them, church isn't relevant, never has been, probably never will. They don't see any reason to go. They don't see any reason to be part of it. They also think that the church, and when I say it this time, I mean the Catholic Church, they think it's out of date. It's a 2,000-year-old church. How can it still be relevant? They think that the rituals are meaningless. And I think here they have a little bit of a point, because growing up, we aren't really taught about what everything means. So maybe to engage these Christians, try a fun fact every week at Mass, such as, why do we put water in the wine? Does anybody know? Most young people probably don't. So it doesn't have to be a lot, but something little, something to get people interested, pique their interest, and show them that rituals that we do aren't just motions, but they mean something, and they mean a lot to us. Now, for the church-going Christian, we often say that we find peer-to-peer engagement. Now, how does that work? If those that go to church find peer-to-peer engagement, why don't those that don't go to church? What's the difference? Is it the fact that they don't go to church? Yes, but why should that impact how we treat them? Should it? I don't think so. I think we have to change the way we treat those that don't go to church, because they don't go to church today, but if we treat them well, they might go to church tomorrow. Those that are church-going say that they find answers to a meaningful life at church. They say that the church is relevant personally and that they find unique relationships with Jesus. I'd say that's a pretty big part of church, wouldn't you? They feel comfortable. And I think that's really important, especially because we all look for a safe place. So if we're so comfortable at church, that means we're loved. We feel the love. We feel the care. So if we're loved, similar to finding that engagement, how do we make others feel loved here? Even if they wouldn't necessarily come to church without us inviting them, how do we make them come and then feel comfortable and feel loved? I also find others tolerant and compassionate. When's the last time you heard somebody, a young person, say that about the Catholic Church? Probably not too recently. But we do. We oftentimes find people at church tolerant and compassionate because it's a family. They've been there for us. They care for us. They've seen us grow up, probably since we were like this tall. And because of that, they care about the things we want and the things we do. So, St. Peter, he's a pretty big one, isn't he? In fact, he's so big He's referred to by name 120 times in the Gospels. That's more than any other disciple put together. Peter is utterly human. He's just kind of what you think he's going to be. He doesn't do too much that you're not expecting. And Gen Z sees that humanity and has a very, very easy way to relate to it. Follow. St. Peter follows Jesus devoutly, with absolutely no questions. After Jesus' time, Peter goes on to share Jesus' story. In Matthew chapter 4, we see, "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men." He wants Peter to follow. Now, Gen Z, a lot follow Jesus, but don't always share because we want to make others comfortable. So if we don't always share that we follow Jesus, but we share everything on social media from, "Oh my gosh, I just met the nicest lady at the gym," to, "Oh my gosh, I just got into college." Why aren't we sharing about Jesus? And what can we do to do more? Just as Peter was a fisher of followers for Jesus, Gen Z fishes for followers on Instagram. Walking on water. Peter asks to be called out of the boat in order to be closer to Jesus and God. After being called, he walks but begins to sink from his lack of faith. In Matthew 14, we read, "He said, 'Come.' Peter got off of the boat and began to walk on the water towards Jesus." Much of Gen Z is in a world or situation where they're comfortable, but want to be pulled into something new. Yes, I enjoy the classes I take at school, but maybe there's something I haven't heard of, haven't seen, didn't know I was interested in, and I want that to be pulled in. Same thing goes for church. Gen Z also easily loses faith. We grew up with people and things disappointing us all the time, and the world changing unexpectedly and extremely rapidly. For those of us in high school, our sophomore, junior, and senior years were all characterized by COVID. And that changed like every day. Questions. Peter asks about everything. Now, I know that I just said Peter follows with no questions. So how does that work? He follows without question. He does as he's told, but he asks for his own understanding. He asks why he's doing it, not if it's right to do it. For example, in John 13, he asks Jesus, "Are you going to wash my feet?" Because he's a little bit flabbergasted at what's happening. Now, Gen Z also questions a lot in their life and oftentimes has the answers right here. Gen Z questions aspects of the church and faith for our own understanding because in the past, people haven't always told us the answers. And by asking these questions, maybe we can push the church to do better. The rock and keys. Peter is the rock that the church is built upon, and is a big reason the church exists as it does. He holds the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Both of these come in Matthew 16. Now, Gen Z, like Peter, is the rock of the church, but the church to come. We will be held responsible for the continuation of the church. If the church doesn't continue, it's because we didn't come to church. We don't have the keys to the church continuing, even though we are the key. You hold those keys. We are the reason that the church will continue. We are also the reason that the church will not continue. It's up to you whether you unlock the door. Denial. Peter, as we all know, denies Jesus 3 times. Peter also seeks political power and glory for himself. We find this in Luke chapter 22. Now, Gen Z also denies knowing Jesus a lot, especially when it makes others uncomfortable. We also grew up seeking glory, and this glory comes in the form of success. We see celebrities all over the world, all of the time, doing things. That's one form of success, right? Achievement is another form of success. We are told, do something, and hopefully, if you do it well enough, you'll receive an award. That achievement is success. We're also told that our education and our job and our financial stability are part of how successful we are. For instance, ever since the time I was in maybe 3rd grade, probably younger, there'd been a sign in my classroom, every single one of them, about how Howard County Public Schools makes their students college and career ready. So ever since 3rd grade, when I had been put into my first GT class, what did I think about? College. I mean, part of that was my grandmother being an assistant principal, but it was always, where are you going to college? And then as I got older and got into high school, it was, oh my gosh, where are you going to college? Have you thought about it? Have you visited schools yet? Oh, you need to take a higher level class. You can push yourself more. You'll do fine. Well, what do you want to major in? What do you want to do for your life? Those, by society, are the standards of success. Where you go to school, what you study, what job you get, how much money you make. But that's all glory. Witness. Peter understood that witness is so much more relatable than just telling somebody to do something. Gen Z listens and recognizes witness so much more than we listen to a reason as just, you do it. Because if I don't have a reason to want to do it, why would I do it to begin with? After, come, follow. Matthew 4, come after me. Matthew 14, come. John 21, follow. Jesus isn't only talking to Peter, he's talking to us all. He's talking to us all to come follow in his footsteps, to do as he does. But I think he's especially talking to Gen Z through Peter, because we are very similar to Peter. We have similar qualities, we've done similar things, granted in a little bit of a different scenario, but nonetheless, we're similar. So, Gen Z. A lot of Gen Z thinks that the church is hypocritical. I mean, we preach that we should love absolutely everybody, no matter what, because we're all part of God's family. But then we're judgmental. For instance, the LGBTQ community. How can we preach to love and then stop others from loving? There are also what I like to call nooks and crannies of the church. Gen Z notices them, and we question them, but rarely do we get an answer, and there are a few reasons for that. A lot of people don't know the answers anyway, because when they were growing up, they never thought to ask the question. And B, a lot of those older folks learned the answers but they think that everybody learned them. So they act as though, oh, well, you should already know the answer. So for me, there are two very big nooks and crannies. First one is the Advent Wreath. 4 candles. Circle, right? Why light them in a circle? Is there a reason? I've never heard of a reason. Everybody that I've asked for a reason has never given me one. There's 4 candles. Why not make a sign of the cross? It's Jesus after all. So I have convinced my mom and my dad for the last maybe 2 or 3 years that we should light our wreath in the shape of a cross. Because nobody has given any of us a reason why not to. And until I hear a reason why not to, I'm going to do something that speaks to me. My second is during the consecration. So I have a picture of Father Jerry up there because I couldn't find any other better pictures. So thank you. I took it during virtual mass, so it's not the best photo quality. You might be able to see right at the bottom of the host, above the chalice, there's like a little speck of light coming off of it. So as some of you may know, I used to be an altar server, and at St. John's, as an altar server in room 1, we sit right in this corner. Well, from there, you have a very different view of Mass. And from there, during the consecration, when the host is held directly above the chalice, there is light. And it comes up from the bottom of the host. And yes, I know that it's just a reflection of the wine inside the chalice reflecting off the gold onto the host. But because it's wine, and it's red wine, the light is a little more red. It's not just white. And the wine is sloshing, so it's continuously changing the shape. Can I think of anything else that's traditionally red and changes shape all the time? Maybe fire? Who's associated with fire? The Holy Spirit. Is there a reason that the host is always, or is held above the chalice? I don't know. I couldn't find any other pictures like that. But for me, at Mass, that is the biggest part of Eucharist. Because as we know, during consecration, it goes from bread and wine to blood and body. But nothing changes physically. But we have faith, and we understand that the substance changes. So I think that when we see this little reflection that I like to think is the Holy Spirit, it's a reason. It's a physical thing that I can see, and I can see that the Eucharist is changing then and there, and that it is no longer bread and wine, but it is blood and body. So I don't know who else is going to have a new nook and cranny, but. So direct engagement. Well, what is it? So this is a picture I took during a pastoral council meeting when I was getting a COVID test. So yes, I was also on my phone. But I thought it was very important to notice that everybody in the line is like this, because they're directly engaged with their phone. So direct engagement is a must, and direct engagement is giving people a place to talk and ask questions with absolutely no shame or judgment. And, there are many ways this can come. This can come in the form of something online, or it can come from being together physically. So how do we allow for direct engagement? So there are 3 big ideas that I think would be helpful. The first is small groups. If we had a group that was multi-generational, maybe 6 or 7 people, maybe a family or 2, they would be able to always see each other. Maybe once a week they go to dinner, or once a month, and they would be able to talk about Christ together with no judgment, no hesitation, because it would be a safe place and a place of love. Another way is a bother the father. So this was actually the first time I had heard about it, but it's basically when all of the priests would set up a table, sit down, and then anybody else that wanted to come would sit and ask questions, church-related questions that they had never been given an answer to. And the priests would be able to answer them together on their own, however. And I'm not saying, well, how come our chairs are set up the way they are? I'm talking like deep theological questions. We can also flip questions. For example, instead of, why does the church believe X, Y, Z? Ask the person, why do you believe X, Y, Z? What makes you believe it? And then you can implement how the church feels and how those two go together. Now, we need this type of engagement for a few reasons. The first is that we come from wanting to be accepted. We always want to be accepted, and I think everybody does, but Gen Z has been through some stuff where people don't always love them and, in fact, always put them down. So that feeling of acceptance means a lot more. We also value hope and social justice. These are both very, very difficult conversations and very prominent ones in today's society. And they need a safe place. So if the church can be that safe place, these conversations can have even more meaning. And I read a quote while I was doing research for this, and I think it works really well. Gen Z doesn't care how much you know until we know how much you care. Faith is a journey. Journeys take time, intentional time. So we have to take the time to be willing and open to having discussions and directly engaging with one another. Plus, from my understanding, a lot of adults enjoy being around young people, and young people enjoy being around adults. So I think it benefits everybody. So we're going to take a few minutes and in our groups talk some more about what makes somewhere a home. So this is going to take about 5 minutes, so I want everybody to talk about what you think makes it a home, and then every minute I'm going to add a new quote. So if that changes the way you think or if it impacts it in any way, I want you to talk about it. So we're just going to start with what makes somewhere home. You guys can go ahead. All right, new quote coming. Home isn't a place, it's a feeling. All right, new quote coming. Home is a place of comfort, but also a place that challenges you to be better. All right, new quote. Home is a place for positive discussion, even if it's about hard topics. All right, last quote coming in. Home is a place of acceptance. All right. So I'm hopeful that you all had a little bit different descriptions of what home means to you, but that they were all similar enough you could understand them. This is mine. A home is somewhere I am able to let my guard down and be my most authentic self. a place where I am surrounded by people that I know love me for who I am. So, who thinks that's pretty homey? I mean, I look at that and I'm like, ooh, HGTV, beautiful. But I don't really think that that's, I couldn't see myself walking in those doors and just feeling happy. What about that? It's a little more homey, right? You can see yourself sitting down for coffee, maybe at your grandmother's house or something. It's more cozy. So when we talk about making somewhere a home, and specifically the church, we need to talk about inviting people in. Because, as I'm sure probably all three groups talked about, a home is somewhere that's accepting. Would I be right? You talked about that? Yeah. So even people that aren't necessarily living in that home should be accepted. So in church terms, those that aren't part of our community should still be loved. I think this is very relatable to the road to Emmaus. Jesus is the stranger, and he appears, and the disciples take him in with no idea who he is. They take him in because why not? So if Jesus was able to be a stranger for the disciples, he's probably a stranger to everybody here. There's probably somebody out in the world that we don't know who they are, but if we tried, we'd learn that Jesus was in them. So just like the disciples, we need to invite the strangers in. And with that, a lot of those strangers are young people. So we need to learn from them. Let them tell their stories so that we can be better equipped to teach them in faith. So this is one of my absolute favorite parables, and it's obviously all about the children. So I think that oftentimes we, as a church, forget to not just let children in, but to actively seek them out and invite them in. Because as we've been talking about young people, I'm really talking about, 8 years old and older. There's a lot of kids under the age of 8, like a lot of them. And if they were here from the time that they were, tiny little people, they'd grow up with it and they would learn to love it because it would become part of their daily lives. So, some prayer. So, in today's day and age, everything is accessible online. Everything's accessible in the palm of your hand or in your pocket or on your wrist. And for those of us that are younger, we grew up with it this way. Everything was that way, and we use the internet for pretty much everything we do. Heck, I take notes for school on an iPad. I don't even use paper anymore. So why should prayer not evolve? There are a multitude of different apps you can download to your phone that all talk about prayer. There are podcasts you can listen to. There are movies you can watch, and I'm not sure a movie really counts as prayer, but it is intentional time with Jesus. So my routine is that on the way to school on A days, I listen to music. Now, I know a lot of us weren't in here until right about when we started, but you may have noticed that there was music playing. That symbolizes the start of my day. Now on B days, I pray the rosary on the way to school, but that's a little harder to just have playing in the background. And then, during the day, when I'm bored or don't have any work to do, I pray a decade. And then, when I get home and I'm getting ready to go to bed, I listen to the daily reflection on Hallow, which we are going to do now.
Hello and and welcome. I'm Jeff Cavins with today's Daily Reflection. Today's reading is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, I Can't Get No Satisfaction.
Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The Holy Gospel according to Mark. In those days, when there again was a great crowd without anything to eat, he summoned the disciples and said, "My heart is moved with pity for the crowd, because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will collapse on the way, and some of them have come a great distance." His disciples answered him, "Where can anyone get enough bread to satisfy them here in this deserted place?" Still he asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" 7, they replied. He ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then, taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the crowd. They also had a few fish. He said the blessing over them, and ordered them distributed also. They ate and were satisfied. They picked up the fragments left over, 7 baskets. There were about 4,000 people. He dismissed them and got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanuta. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
In 1965, the Western world was going through tumultuous times, and the Rolling Stones repeated a social anthem, I can't get no satisfaction. The more things change, the more things stay the same. In today's gospel reading, we are back talking about satisfaction. It was just 2 chapters earlier that Jesus fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. By doing so, he showed that he was enough when it comes to satisfying the needs of Israel. Now, Jesus is in Gentile territory, and he is going to demonstrate that he is indeed enough to meet the needs of Gentiles as well. All throughout the Bible, God is supporting his people and feeding them what they need at that particular time. Even when Israel was not eating off of the regular menu, he gave them manna in the wilderness. God worked this miracle every day. Israel learned that they didn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. When I listened to Jonathan read this gospel story today, I was hit with something. How did the disciples forget that only 2 chapters earlier, Jesus did the same thing? But this time, it was as if they had never been down this road before, as if the feeding of the 5,000 didn't happen. Jesus said that he had compassion on the people because they were hungry after being with him for 3 days, and he didn't want them to faint. That compassion comes through loud and clear. What is not so clear, however, is that the disciples' memory of chapter 6 seems to be foggy. They seem to have forgotten the feeding of the 5,000. His disciples answered him, "Where," scratching their head, I'm sure, "where can anyone get enough bread to satisfy them here in this deserted place?" Now, if you meditate on this reading long enough, a problem emerges, and here it is. You can be with Jesus and experience his provision, and then you can forget that Jesus is the one who will fill you up and satisfy your soul. Get this, while you are with him. So you can literally be with him and forget about his mercy. You can literally be with him and forget about his provision, his forgiveness, his compassion, and even his amazing plan. This is amazing, and no doubt we would say there is no way that this could happen to me. If I were with Jesus, there is no possible way that I would forget about his goodness and his provision. Well, you know, we can check your hypothesis. Come into the laboratory for just a moment. Go ahead and lay down on the couch, put your feet up, relax. I have a few questions for you. In the last week, did you worry about anything? In the last week, did you feel alone and abandoned? In the last week, did you forecast a negative outcome to something regarding the kids? In the last week, did you panic over your finances? In the last week, did you become anxious about your job? In the last 24 hours, did you thank him for the daily bread? Okay, now you can sit up. Now I hope you scored well, but if you are like a lot of us, you forgot about his provision, even when he was with you this week. You know what is even weirder? We do this in the midst of Mass. No kidding. We do. As Jesus is giving his body and his blood to us for our salvation, we are preoccupied and anxious about something at work. Walking with Jesus and forgetting Jesus at the same time. Another point that should make us think is his audience. It was a Gentile audience who were hanging on every word for not one, not two, but 3 days. Have you ever been to a religious event where you didn't eat for 3 days? These people were really hungry for God. If you feel convicted here, go ahead and squirm a little. Many people have a problem with a homily that goes for 12 minutes rather than the regular 10. Many people have no earthly idea what they would do to fill one holy hour. When we look back at our lives, we could probably take note of many times when we left Jesus for a lot less than a good lunch. Whatever their state after 3 days, Jesus was concerned that they might faint. The closest I've ever come to an event such as this was covering World Youth Day in Paris. 3 days of waiting, sitting, listening, and fellowshipping with one another. But to be fair, we did have some croissants. What would have been better for the disciples is having looked at the situation as an opportunity rather than an impossibility. The disciples are fixed on who is going to bring satisfaction. I've got to state this again. They just witnessed Jesus feeding the 5,000, and they are puzzled now as to who will satisfy this group of 4,000. Hello, McFly, anyone home? Well, we have the answer, don't we? Jesus is the one who satisfied. He satisfied them, he satisfies us. I sure hope that we don't have to get quizzed over this for a third or fourth time. The truth is that we are more like the disciples than we care to admit. Listen, I want to encourage you today. St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. When your problem meets God's grace, the result is satisfaction. A satisfaction that the world is desperately looking for. We are living in a world that can't get no satisfaction, but we have the answer. Let's lead the way by seeing every situation before us as an opportunity rather than an impossibility. Let's build on the past and trust Jesus. I'm Jeff Cavins, and that's today's Daily Reflection.
So that's pretty good, right? You know, it's 10 minutes, probably learned something or at least thought of something differently than you had previously. So that's not the way I end my night, but it's close to. I end my night in prayer. So I know we just listened to that for about 10 minutes, but we're going to take a few minutes to pray for whoever you would like, whatever you would like. You can do this as a group. You can do this on your own, however you would like. But go ahead and pray. All right, whenever you guys are ready. So, as you've heard about my day of prayer, there are a lot of different ways that we can pray. We can pray by listening to music and maybe even singing along, depending on how good your voice is. And there are apps that are there to help us. There are even podcasts. So for those of you that listen to podcasts or would like podcast recommendations, here are a few that I recommend. Girlfriends, Abiding Together, Ave Explorers, Bible in a Year, and The Bible Project. So prayer should be personal, right? It makes sense. It's your prayers. But Jesus isn't just there to listen. He's a friend. And I don't know when the last time you talked to a friend was, but did you say, oh, can you do this for me? Can you do that for me? What about this? Will you do that? How about you do this too? How about you do this for somebody else? No, right? You listened, you heard what they had to say, you had a conversation. So, Jesus is a friend. Granted, he's not, sitting in front of you, you can't see him, but he's there. So you have to have a conversation. It's not a one-sided relationship, because that's not a good way for any relationship to be, especially the most important one in your life. But I know that it can be really hard. So, do you hear God's voice? Think about it for a second and be completely honest. Do you hear his voice? I don't. I don't hear anything. But I get this feeling, and I really don't know how to explain it, other than it's like the biggest and best hug in the entire world, and like every part of my body is just melting into warmth. And I know that that is Jesus, that is God, but I don't hear anything. It's not like I hear a voice in my head, hey Claire, I love you, you're wonderful, go do great things. No, I feel this. So when I have a conversation, if I'm not going to hear an answer, I can't say, oh, how was your day? Did you go do something fun? Did you go, what was your favorite ride at the amusement park? It's not going to work if I can't hear anything. But I know that I get a feeling. So I ask yes or no questions. I ask if something is true or false. If I get the feeling, the answer was yes. No feeling, the answer was no. So I don't hear anything, but I managed to have a conversation anyway. So I know there are probably a lot of people out there that don't actually hear a voice, but that just means there's some other way that God and Jesus are talking to you, so you got to figure out what that way is, and then maybe adapt the way you pray to have a conversation through whatever that means is. So, tactile learning. As a lot of people would know, or might know, young people have been exposed to all different types of learning, and a lot of us have been asked, what's your learning style? So for some, that's a visual learner, some it's an audible learner, some it's, I have to take notes. And a lot of people would say that it's tactile. I have to hold something, I have to manipulate it in order for me to learn. And especially really little kids. So Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, which we used to have here, and I went through that as a little kid, is all about tactile learning, about Christ and about the Gospels. So there are a few different things that you can do. So there were maps, and I think this has 3 different maps. One of them is the Topography Map of the area, and so you can see the elevation changes and see what the terrain sort of would have looked like. And from there you can grasp more, that's what it means when he went to the top of a mountain. That's a pretty big mountain, right? You can start to understand things better than just, oh, Jesus went to the top of a mountain. He was standing up there for a while. And then it also has a map of Jerusalem. And then there are pieces that are the walls to the city and then all of the buildings in the city. And it allows you to create the city, to understand how it all works. Because I don't know how many of us have actually been to Jerusalem. Probably not very many. So being able, especially as a little kid, right? Who takes their 4-year-old to Jerusalem? Not very many people, I would assume. So being able to see that gives more context and makes it easier to learn. There are also different activities. And it's important to note that everything is Montessori style. So you can do whatever you kind of want to do and learn from it. And therefore, some kids have their favorites and stuff. So there is a box, and the doors open, and it has these stacks of books. And you lay them all out, and then the kids have to put them in. Well, what do you think those books represent? All the different books of the Bible. And the taller the book is, the more chapters the book has, and you have to put them in order. And then you can tell the difference between the New Testament books and the Old Testament books, because the background of the box is a different color. When you look at that, you realize, wow, there's not a whole lot of New Testament in comparison to everything else. But you understand, oh, it's not just one thing. It's a collection of stories, a collection that is important, and they all impact one another. And then there are the vestments, which when I was really little used to be my favorite thing because I was almost small enough to fit into them. And you could move them around, and that's how I learned what colors were worn when, which would prove to be helpful picking out a cincture. And so little things like that, most kids at the age of 6 don't know what color vestment should be worn that week and don't know what it really means. Oh, it's green. Oh my gosh, last week it was purple, right? It's not anything that they know. And then there is the story of the lost pearl. And that, as I got a little older, became my favorite because there was one pearl separate from the ones in the basket, and our teacher would hide it in there, and then we had to find it. And it was, understandable, because how many times have you lost something really small and then not known where it was? So for me, it's like an earbud. It falls under my bed, and I'm looking around. I'm like, oh my gosh, I lost it. Where'd it go? I don't want to go buy new ones. And then I find it, and I feel so much better. And as a little kid, I didn't really have that, right? My parents kind of took charge and made sure everything was in the right spot. So understanding it by manipulating it is easier. And then there's the Good Shepherd one, which is it's really cool because you have this pasture with rope and you have all these sheep, and then you bring the little Jesus and he's got a sheep over his shoulders. It's like, oh my gosh, look, he found him. And so those are some of my favorites from when I was a little kid. But they all involve characters and pieces that make it easier to teach the kids. And it makes it fun because the kids don't really know they're learning. You just are like, oh my gosh, I'm playing. But you end up learning. And then one of the things, which is for the older kids, and I don't have a picture of it, is this really long ribbon. And we used to run it from the top of these stairs all the way down to the offices, around, and all the way back. So pretty long. And for every rib on the ribbon, it signified about 1,000 years. And then there were little markings like, okay, this is first people, this was, Moses, this was Jesus. And after Jesus, there's only 2 tabs before it gets to today. And it's like, whoa, okay, that's a really long time before Jesus, and then not so much time since Jesus. And then the next tab changes into a new color. what? What's going to come? Well, it's called the Parousia, and it's when everything is absolute bliss, and you're with God, and nothing else matters. So it's been, almost 15 years since I've, touched that, and I can tell you pretty much all of the details about it. And I'm sure that I will be able to tell you that in another 15, probably in another 50 years. Because that tactile learning impacted me in so many ways that traditional religious education didn't. And it impacts kids. For instance, we got to learn about the consecration. And I remember I was probably 8 or 9, and one of the really little girls doesn't look at anything and just goes through the entire thing. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. And we're sitting there, and, it wasn't anything special to me because I was able to do that too. But like a 5-year-old is saying Mass, basically, saying parts of the Mass. That's not very normal, but it's amazing what happens. And this is all because we value doing things and then seeing a finished product. So, acting justly and walking humbly. So, millennials and Gen Z all see Jesus in the poor and needy, and we recognize the injustices in the world. We see that things are wrong, and we want to fix them. And oftentimes, we want to try and fix them through the church, but don't always know how much the church does to help. So the map, every country that is in blue, is a place that CRS helps. I didn't know that. I've been putting money in the rice bowl for years, and I only thought it helped in maybe 10 or 12 countries. No, it's a pretty big portion of the world. And that makes me feel so much better about the money. Not that it wasn't good that I'm putting this money in there anyway, but I'm helping more people than I even knew I could. And then there's ASP. It does really well here because we get to help both those in our local community, but also those not in our local community that have injustices we don't commonly see here. And this form of helping allows us to have friends that do it, allows us to have peers, and to create personal relationships with people that will never die. Some of those people are sitting in this room, and some of those relationships with those people in this room are some of the most meaningful in my life. We also then create relationships with the people we help. Granted, I may never see them again, but I know their story, and I am part of that story, and that makes me feel good. Now, millennials and Gen Z have also experienced a lot of mental health issues in comparison to other generations, and oftentimes we seek help, but that help isn't found, especially through the church. So, what can we do to help? Is there anything? Now, I'm not a mental health expert, so I don't know all the little things that go with it, but I'm sure there's something, even if it's just, sitting together and talking and having other adults in the church talk about how God has helped them through their struggles with mental illness, because I am pretty sure there are a few adults that have had mental illness. And then gender equality is a huge issue in today's society. And the church kind of makes it difficult. The priesthood and deacons. If you're a man, you can do that. If you're a woman, your option is a nun. Now, for me, since I was little, I didn't really understand that. And I was like, oh my gosh, I could be a priest. And then I couldn't be a priest. And then I was like, oh, but I could be a deacon. And then I couldn't be a deacon. And I was like, well, maybe by the time I'm old enough, they'll realize we need more priests and we need more deacons. and they'll open it up to women. But the older I get, the less that seems that'll happen. And I don't want to be a nun. It's not something I'm called to do. But there are other things I can do in the church. I can speak up, but I don't have as much opportunity because I'm a woman. And that doesn't end at the church, right? I want to be an engineer. Only 17% of engineers are women. I'm in high school, and I've already taken classes where I am the only girl in my class, and the teacher is a man. Pope Francis talks about women and how he feels they are such an important part of the church, and I think that this aspect and this interpretation from him gives so much hope because we are able to move forward in that hope, and others can learn from it. All right, we're gonna play a game in your group, but for the game, I'm gonna have you guys stand up because you've been sitting for a little bit. So in your group, you're gonna have a question, and I'll come around and tell your question to you. You're gonna discuss it for about 8 minutes. So you're gonna see both how long 8 minutes is and how short it is. For those that are virtual, what are we doing to build community for millennials in our parishes in order to connect them back to the sacramental life of the church? Okay, group 1, so that's the group over there. Should the differences between each generation shape and influence the way we try to reach out to each generation? If so, how? Group 2, so that's this group in the front. What sold you on the church? How can we adapt our approach to sell that to millennials and Gen Z? And then the group in the back, what's one nook and cranny about the church that you think everyone new to the church and returning should know? So go ahead and discuss for about 8 minutes. All right. Alrighty, are you guys ready for the next step of our game? So in your group, you're gonna prepare for a few minutes a very quick presentation. It's only like 30 seconds to a minute, and it's gotta be something that's like engaging. So I don't want you just like, hi, we said blah, blah, blah. No, I mean like, oh my gosh, yeah, we talked about this, blah, 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 blah. All right, so think about it, figure out who, you can have more than one person, you could make it like a conversation, but figure out who you want to do it, what you want to talk about. You have 3 minutes on the clock. Go. All right, your time is up. All right, you can go ahead. We're gonna take a quick bathroom break. So if you need to go to the bathroom, feel free to go. And if you need to move any chairs to do something for your presentation, you can do that. All right, here's our group 1 presentation. The question was about how we should let the differences in each generation influence the way we teach.
Hello. So this begins, the question was, should we? And yes, we should. And one thing that our group discussed and we wanted to point out is that sometimes we believe that with marriage, for example, you fall in love with your partner and then you observe the rules. A lot of human nature is geared that way. However, when it is, when we're working with children toward building their faith, sometimes we ask them to observe the rules and then hope that they fall in love with the faith later on. And we think that may have always been a disconnect, but particularly with this generation, we think that we could probably interact with them better if we make them feel welcome, loved, wanted, accepted. And then, you know, their relationship with Jesus is what will always hopefully bring them back and observe and deepen their faith. So.
Awesome. Yay. I think another thing that we touched upon was taking people as they are, this generation in particular, but every generation as they come along, making sure that people feel accepted as they are when they enter the church and as they express their faith is always extremely important, because each generation has different ideals and values as a whole, and making sure they're identified as time goes along within people is important, because that's how you preserve the church as you go forward. Making people feel comfortable as they are, as they worship, is always going to be important, because that's how you propitiate faith at large. And I think this church does a great job of doing that, but making sure it's instilled within the community as a whole is something that needs to occur on a larger scale, in my opinion, but is definitely something that we need to do working forward.
All right, thank you, Group 1. And for anybody that doesn't know, Evan is the other youth member of the Pastoral Council. Yay! All right, Group 2, come on up. And Group 2's question was, what sold you on the church, and how can we adapt our approach to sell that to millennials and Gen Z?
Let's do like a one. Is that all right with you guys? Okay, so we thought we would do like a question-answer sort of exercise. Oh, okay. Can you hear me better? Okay. So what sold me on the faith, well, let me ask you guys this. So who here can relate to wanting to stay in the faith because of your love of the Eucharist? Okay, so that was my experience. There was a time when I kind of questioned staying or going, and it was related to clergy abuse. But I knew that everywhere I looked, the real presence of the Eucharist wasn't there, and so Jesus is here in our home, in the parish, or in the Catholic Church, and so that's what made me want to stay.
I guess what made me stay in the church was my trust in my parents. Through college, I'd go to Mass every Sunday. I just stayed with it, honestly, for my whole life because, well, then I got hooked myself, but it was because my parents, I trusted in they were really good Catholics and I trusted them. How many of you all had that feeling that your parents were what got you in?
As a millennial, one thing that really drives me is trying to be part of something larger than myself. And I was really, really struck by the Catholic Church, Catholic being universal. It is a church that crosses all peoples, all nations, all cultures, all races, everything. It is a universal church. You can go to anywhere in the world and they'll be reading the same readings on the same day. The Mass will be very similar, and I really, really love that aspect. Maybe you feel part of something greater. So how many of you that also sold you on the church?
What brought me back to the church was someone I admired, someone who was very kind. He was involved in the church and he lived his faith. He invited me to attend church and he introduced me. You know, when you do the sign of peace and it's not just a handshake, it's after Mass. He introduced me to these people and I felt like he would ask questions and he knew them. And I didn't know the people on the other side, but I always knew the people where we sat. And I thought, this is my community here, and it made me feel welcome. So how many of you have been invited by either the inspiration of someone that you admire and you see that they live their faith, or somebody who just says, let me introduce you to somebody who sits near me? It was relationships for me. I'm glad it was for you too.
when I was in college, I went through a period of doubt. Like, what if this is all made up? And it so happened that I had a college roommate who was involved in the Catholic Charismatic movement, and she was on fire, talking about a relationship with Jesus and in a way that I had never heard. And I began to explore and to fall in love with the person of Jesus, and then to fall in love with the church I had been raised in, the Catholic Church. How many of you have had people in your life who, with their joy and their faith, influenced you to love your church more?
One of the things I experienced was in the 70s, I was going through a divorce. And I was a member of St. John's, but I remember all the things that I couldn't do because I was separated and going through a divorce that I was not choosing. So I became kind of estranged, and by estranged I mean I would skip maybe 2 Sundays and then go to Mass for 2 Sundays and things like that. I just never stopped. And it wasn't until the SWORD program, which was here, Separated, Widowed, or Divorced, that was popular then. I had a group that the church was reaching out to me, and we would do in-home masses that made me feel connected and things like that. How many of you have ever had an experience where you felt estranged because of the beliefs or the rules, if you want to call it that way, of the church, and then something came along like a social justice program and invited you back? Anybody had an experience like that? Yeah.
So I'm a cradle Catholic, and I too, when I was younger, because I'm Gen X, I followed my parents through the church. I was especially had an aunt that was very devout, and we went and did all the rosaries and all the special days, and it became a routine for me. Went to college, met some friends. We also continued, but I think what kept me in the church or kept me more engaged was when I found out that I had something to share. When I was in my nursing program, one of my professors found out that I could play piano, so when I started playing for some of the groups there, I was invited to the Newman Center to start playing there. And then over the years, it's like I fall away and come back. I came back through the, I've always been to church, but like my engagement was not so much until living here, maybe the Acts retreat. When I was invited to be on the team, they found out that I was a musician and they put me in charge of all the music. And that's when my faith really took off, was probably my devotion to Mass more so was in 2010. I know it took most of my life, but after finding that I had a purpose and a purpose here, that really, so how many of you have found a purpose in going to church and had a talent you could share?
Yeah. All right, group 3. And their question was, what's one nook and cranny about the church that you think everyone new to the church and returning should know?
This might be a little bit particular to here, but I think it can be applied everywhere too. Okay, so pretend I'm in a box, an imaginary box. Ready? A different box. We're gonna pop out of the box and say, hi, I'm Catholic. Hi, I'm not Catholic. But we can be united in our faith, our works, our conversation, and our love. In COVID style, so unity. and it goes for the unity of what you were saying about the Catholic Church at large, too. I think that's one of the most awesome things. You can go anywhere in the world on a Sunday, and it's the same. Because God is the same. Yet so different, right?
All right.